Hey folks, as you're filtering in here, we've got a lot of people registered for this one, so we'll sit tight for a few minutes as people come in, as we're just hitting 10 o'clock now. Give you an update on what we know about the lame duck sessions so far. So some people filtering in, I think at 10:02. Okay, so it's going to be a little bit more than a minute, which by the way, that feels like a long time. We're just sitting here watching people not say something. But we're going to wait until 10:02 to get started as people continue to filter in. It's a really important topic. I just want to make sure that everybody who would like to get an update on it has an opportunity for the full update. Huge stakes on things that are before the legislature today. We're going to run through what we know so far. Just a few more seconds and we will get started. Sarah's just offered in the chat here too that we are recording this and we will make this available after the fact for you to review or share. And I see it is 10:02. So we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Brian Kelly, CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan. Thank you for joining us today. The purpose of this webinar is to do a briefing on what has happened in this legislative lame duck session and what still might happen as we are probably in the last week of session. So there's been a really dramatic back and forth. But let me start out with a thank you. I want to say thank you to our members that stepped up in a huge way, in a record-setting way, in fact, in responding to our calls to action over the past few weeks. I know that we've asked a lot of you. I know that we've sent out multiple calls to action, and it's just because there were lots of threats that were being added to the table. And it did make a difference. You know, there were some things that went through that we were not happy about, but there were a lot of things that didn't go through. Some of our biggest concerns did get stopped, and I know that that was in no small part because we had thousands, and I do literally mean thousands of reach outs to public officials from our members saying, please don't do this. Or in the case of fixing a few things, we need these things done. And so we, as usual, we don't always get the outcomes that we're looking for, but we want to make sure that the small business voice is prominent in the discussion. So the reason why there's a lot of intensity, and it's not unusual for there to be a lot of intensity at the end of a legislative term, but in this case, in the beginning of this legislative term was the first time in 40 years that the Democratic Party controlled all three kind of legs of the stool in making new laws: the House, the Senate, the governor's office. And with this last election, the House flipped back to Republican control. So there was kind of a flurry of activity, like, wow, if this trifecta, they call it inside the Beltway, of one party control is coming to an end, like this is the last chance to get some things done. And unfortunately, a lot of those things that were being pushed were things that would have been detrimental to small business owners. So it really led to us and some other colleagues of ours stepping in, telling the story about what these policy changes would mean. And so we had some big concerns that came up. So we want to tell you a little bit of that story. And we're going to start. I guess I'll start with what I consider to be the most certain bad news, and that is something that has already passed the House and the Senate. It is on its way to the governor's desk for signature, and we do expect that she will sign it, and that is changes to the unemployment insurance system. So I'm going to kick it over to Kelly Saunders, who's the VP of our government relations efforts here at SBAM, to give us the scoop on what happened there and what the changes will be.
Well, thanks, Brian, and thank you all for tuning in today to get this update. A little over a week and a half ago, we had issued a call to action around unemployment insurance expansion, going upping the weeks from 20 to 26 weeks, and then also an increase in benefit amount. We had been talking about for the last, couple months. It seems like that the weeks had always been established on what the legislature was focusing on, but the dollar amount was a little bit in flux. We heard as high as 602 in the last month, which obviously, with it being at, in the high 300s, was, essentially tripling or doubling, excuse me, can't do my math this morning, the dollar amount, which is an increase on our employers throughout Michigan. And so we went to work in advocating for the legislature to not move forward with these expansions, and called upon you as well to speak into the system. There's obviously been numerous problems with the unemployment insurance system, specifically during COVID, when the trust fund was essentially raided and used as a social safety net, and diminish it to where we were almost broke. And so we had obviously worked really hard to get the trust fund to be a center focus on getting that to be healthy again, to root out fraud in the system. And SBAM had been sitting at a table for a long time with the director of the unemployment insurance agency to identify those needs from employers and to get some different reforms in place. And that department had been making some pretty good strides to implementing those different facets that we had identified. So our message was get the UI trust fund healthy. Let's root out fraud. And then we can talk about expansion of these things if that's done right. Unfortunately, the legislature was impatient and they did not wait for that to occur. We know with new systems that are being implemented within the UIA, it needs to be done right, because you don't want to open it up for fraud again when you're making these changes. But unfortunately, we were not successful in staving that off. It was made known very publicly by leadership within the Senate and within the House that they had intended to move this forward. And so last week, Monday, pretty much with ease, it moved through the Senate and the House. 20 Democrats in the Senate voting for its passage, 1 Republican, and then 56 Democrats and 2 Republicans in the House voting to increase both weeks and benefits. Unfortunately, when we were talking about the 602 number, it ended up being worse than that. It will be $614 with a phase-in that they say is 3 years, but is really 2. And so January 1st of 2025, the weekly benefit will be $446, January 1st of 2026, $530, and then January 1st of 2027, moving to $614. So while we are very disappointed in this move, the bill has been presented to the governor and is awaiting her signature. And we anticipate that she will sign it, even though there was a little bit of drama last night that she wants some other things moved and would not be signing bills until her economic development package was moved forward. However, this is a pretty big initiative for Democrats, and so we do anticipate that will be signed by the governor. Again, cannot reiterate enough what Brian said. We really appreciate you taking action in our calls to action. We saw thousands of emails flood the system on how you really want the system to be run effectively before any increases were taken up. But unfortunately, we were not successful in this specific space.
So we will see a an increase. If there's an increase in benefits, duration and weekly benefit, there will be then an increase in the rates that you pay. Right? It's just a fact that is going to happen. And so while the issue obviously will still continue to be debated, future legislatures and our agenda we don't just drop and give up on the issue, but a bill passed. No, so let's talk about some of the actually, before we talk about any of the other issues, I want to talk a little bit about the timeline of the landscape and a legislative rule which kind of dictates what's still on the table. It will make sense, a little bit more sense to you if you have this discussion first. So Jacob, why don't you give us a bit of an idea of what the timeline is for the remainder of session, and why we are able to fairly confidently determine things that still could possibly be passed this year.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And good morning, everybody. My name is Jacob Manning. I'm the grassroots coordinator and policy advisor here at SBAM, part of the advocacy team with Kelly and Brian. And what we have had, what we've experienced already in the last week has obviously been this flurry of activity that Brian described at the top. And we are looking at just a handful of session days remaining left in this legislative year. The House is actually coming, they're taking attendance right now. The Senate is set to meet this week as well. But today is likely the last day that the House will even meet. And there's been a lot of discussion and drama on whether or not the House will be able to have 56 members in order to make a quorum, in order to vote on any legislation. Last week, Republicans walked out of session, and something that we can discuss further here. And then there's also some internal dynamics at play in the Democratic caucus as well that puts that 56 number at question. So the rule that Brian was referring to that is really important when we're talking about how the next couple of weeks will unfold is something that's written into the Michigan Constitution. So it's not a rule that can be suspended by the legislature. It's written in the Constitution, is referred to as the 5-day rule, which means that bills that aren't out of essentially what it means is that bills that aren't out of the first chamber by a certain deadline cannot be heard by the next chamber until 5 days pass. So since we're dealing with a finite amount of time, we have the holidays coming up, and we have dynamics that are making it difficult for legislators to pull together enough votes to pass bills. It's likely that the last possible date that we would be looking at for any activity is Monday. The Senate is saying that they could come in Monday to hear testimony or to consider some bills, but these would only be bills that were passed by the House today, because there need to be 5 days that pass after a bill passes one House in order for the second chamber to take it up. And the House is not expected to come back for any more bills, and so any new activity that the legislature will be considering will be the deadline is sort of today to get moving on that with just the finite amount of time that we're working with.
Right, so this rule kind of works in our favor at this point. A couple things happening with over the next issue we're going to talk about, the Earned Sick Time Act and the tip to wage credit. You know, Republicans have basically said we're not going to vote on any bills until those issues get dealt with. We're not going to come to session until then. And there's and then also some dissension within the Democratic caucus, where there's at least one representative saying I'm probably not going to go to any more sessions until ironically, until these issues, the same issues get addressed. The tip to wage credit, there's good bipartisan support actually for that, but it's been blocked so far, making it through it, even getting it up for a vote. But since there's only a few days of session left, meeting that 5-day period, that 5-day rule becomes basically impossible after today. So it really does work in our favor in keeping additional bad things from happening. So that's going to narrow our discussion a little bit. We're going to say, yep, here's some that have already met the 5-day rule, so we still got to worry about them, and here's some others that haven't. Okay, so two bills that have not met the 5-day rule and therefore are likely, unfortunately, tragically, dead for this term. We're going to talk about now, and that is the restoration of the tipped wage credit and fixes to the Earned Sick Time Act, or ESTA, as it is called. Kelly, give us the scoop on where those stand and what we expect, if anything, for the rest of the year.
Yeah, I hate to deliver this news because we've obviously been talking about this since the Supreme Court handed down its decision on July 31st. And I just want to state that this was not for a lack of trying. You have all been amazing at sharing how these two policies specifically would impact your various businesses, We know that the Earned Sick Time Act as written is arduous and unworkable. We've offered common sense solutions with 5 changes that were written into a bill to be considered. We've also had very dynamic discussions surrounding the tipped wage and how important that is to the industry. There is a general understanding on how this impacts the business community, but unfortunately, between the House and the Senate, there was a lot of debate and stakeholder input from both sides that were arguing passionately for their respective causes to get people on board with one solution. And so we have reached a stalemate. And unfortunately, too, these two issues became a little bit entangled in other issues that people wanted to move. I'm sure you've heard over the last, essentially week and a half about a road funding deal. And there were different mechanisms that were put on the table that if you do this, then you can get ESTA in the tip credit. And not always good deals, unfortunately. It doesn't mean that we were arguing for one way or the other. It just means that the system in the decision makers that sit at the table could not come to an agreement. And so therefore, it's very much diminishing as we sit here and talk to you about these bills moving. To Brian's point, the Republican caucus said, we will not sit here unless these two things are taken up. And so they walked out, and they have not been there since they walked out last week. And to Brian's point, there are people within the Democratic caucus, one specifically, a Detroit Democrat said, unless these things are put on the table, I'm not coming to the Capitol. I'm just not doing it. And there's some other things that she specifically wanted on the table. And so you have a very fractional caucus and House right now that is just not willing to come back and vote. And so it leaves us in a place where, unfortunately, we have to look forward to what's next and in preparing you and preparing ourselves in order to see what we're dealing with. So February 21st, a reminder, is when the Earned Sick Time Act in 2025 would go into place. And as of today, that will be the case. As far as the minimum wage, reminder that the minimum wage will be increased on January 1st and then will be increased again on February 21st to $12.48. And then the tip credit will also be at 48% on February 21st of 2025. I do want to say that while we are very disappointed that this is the case, a new legislative session begins on January 1st. And so therefore, we will be working with leadership, current and new, coming in order to get new bills and new policies introduced to try and make progress. So while this is essentially bad news and not what we wanted, we will not stop. And I think it's safe to say that the new incoming Speaker of the House won't stop when he takes the reins on January 1st to try and make sure that we can make implementation changes. So Brian, I'll leave it to you to add any other commentary, but that's where we sit today.
Yeah, so we unfortunately these neither of those bills, while it's technically still possible for those bills to pass, after today it will not be technically possible. But it's technically possible, but it's not going to happen. The ingredients, it got too wrapped up. And so while it was, if either bill would have been put up for a vote in the House, they would have passed. Guaranteed. There's no question about that. They would have had the support to pass, and but it got tied up in some other issues, and so they're not going to. So it really does beg the question. So we have some people on both sides of the aisle, one entire caucus, and then and a fair amount of dissension, but one representative in particular, Representative Whitsitt from Detroit, that have essentially walked out and said, look, if you guys aren't going to deal with these really important issues to small businesses, we're just not going to participate in the rest of the session. The thing that is good to us about that is that all these other threats that we're about to talk about, that those threats go down if they're not in session, right? They can't pass them most of them, if they're not in session. So this is one of these weird circumstances where if it's true that they won't run the bills that we need, then it probably is better that they just go home and stop session so that we don't have other damaging things that pass in the meantime. So that's kind of where we stand today. All right, so I know this has all been terrible news, probably very difficult to listen to, but you'll always get a straight answer from us and where things stand. All right, so let's talk then about a few other issues then that I think are going to be particularly important. At this point, really, we think the Senate is going to be in session, but there's an interesting development, like literally in the last 15 minutes that has developed, which is that another senator from Detroit, Sylvia Santana, has indicated maybe I won't go to Senate session because there's a power dynamic between the Senate majority leader and the governor. They're of the same party, but the governor is making certain demands, and those demands are not landing well with her party members in the Senate. And so there's some like open dissension happening there. So it could be that a Senate action is in question, which if you'd asked me last week, I'd say Senate looks lockstep. Looks like they could pass things at will last week. So let's talk through. I'm going to have Jacob run through some of the bills that have like made it through this. We're going to start with bills that have made it through their first chamber, and therefore the 5-day rule. Remember, we talked about that 5-day waiting period that's already met. So these bills, as long as there's any sessions at all before the end of the year, they could be taken up and passed and sent out to the governor. Jacob, what are the ones? What's the landscape of the bills that are second chamber bills? 5-day rule is met. They're live and on the table, and we need to worry about.
Yeah, so going into this lame duck period, we had a bucket of maybe 20 or so different issues that were in play. And to this point, we have narrowed this list down to just the bills that have passed their first chamber and are now what I think we would consider imminent threats if both chambers can get their people together, get enough people to build a quorum and take a vote on them. And we have 5 different issues here down from the list of about 20. And amongst these issues, we have the Senate Bill 1173, which, we've talked a lot over the last couple of years about this local preemption repeal. This is a provision of Michigan law that says that all wage and labor laws are set at the state level. Local governments can't make those changes. Our argument behind this is that for small businesses, it creates a patchwork of over 1,800 different municipalities across the state. Each could have their own wage and labor laws, making it very difficult to track compliance for small business owners, particularly for people who have multiple locations or employees in different locations, just a whole level of complication. The actual bill for the full repeal of that law appears to be dead. But it also appears that the Senate in particular has taken a more narrowly tailored approach to try and chip away at that law because it didn't seem that they had the political supporting to do a full repeal of the law. So this bill, Senate Bill 1173, would allow local units of government to implement their own prevailing wage requirements, a lot of project specific issues that would be dealing with areas where governmental or local funding is provided, and they could restrict, add different wage and labor restrictions in those areas. And so obviously not as bad as the full version, but still something that we're going to oppose pretty adamantly, just for the same reasons that we oppose the initial, just the patchwork effect, how hard it makes competition in these projects and for these bids for small contractors problematic there. So we also have a series of data privacy mandates. There was Senate Bill 659, which was a package to implement a new sweeping data privacy law in Michigan. There have been a series of changes to this bill as stakeholders have been engaged, but still not pleased with where the bill is at now. Our stance on this is that we don't want Michigan to be an outlier state. We don't want it to be harder to do business in Michigan online than it is in other places, particularly as more business and more commerce does move to online platforms. Overly burdensome regulations that put us out of competition, out of lockstep with the rest of the country, should be generally avoided, and we feel that this bill would do that. There were also included in this data field a series of data breach mandates that would put a lot of new requirements on businesses that were targeted by a data breach and had some of their consumer or some of their data leaked, and what their obligations were to the victims of those leaks that would also put us out of lockstep with what's going on a national level and would be harmful there.
So just to be clear too, that this is something that we do tend to come back to often, time and time again, is that we do like for Michigan's laws and rules to be similar to what the standard practices in other places are. There seems to be among this legislature in the last couple of years a desire to move Michigan to outlier status in a bunch of areas. And so in these sorts of things, like you look at it, in isolation and say, well, do we need to change this or not change it? And yeah, maybe some changes are needed, but what is the normal practice? And are we going to essentially kick certain types of businesses out of Michigan or make it so that those in Michigan are very uncompetitive with small businesses in other states, or big businesses actually in other states? That's a big concern. So as a reminder, we're talking about bills that are still live, still a threat. They've met the 5-day threshold, and we've been through 2 of them. All right, Jacob, what else is on that list?
Yeah, and just to clarify, on those first sets of bills that I talked about, both of these did pass the Senate last week, and so yes, they are awaiting a vote in the House, and it is all, of course, dependent on whether or not the House can gather a quorum. We also have a series of bills that have been branded as polluter pay, which would provide a series of pretty extreme changes to Part 201 and environmental cleanup standards. Our feeling on this is that these bills go way too far and would disincentivize a lot of investment in brownfield sites, would make it a lot more difficult for people dealing with manufacturing, and some pretty radical changes to cleanup standards that would be, in our opinion, overly burdensome.
Yeah, now one thing I'd throw into this too is they come up with catchy phrases with this. And so they say, oh, we're going to pass a polluter pay law. Well, Michigan already has polluter pay. Those who do pollution, who actually are responsible for the pollution, they have to pay. In many cases, though, there are kind of orphan sites where whoever did the polluting a long time ago, they don't even exist anymore. They went bankrupt, whatever. And so what this bill does is it changes it to owner pay for somebody else's pollution. So if you happen to own a property that at some point in the past had been polluted, then these bills move that liability to the current owner. And what we're trying to say is that, like, current practices where you can buy a property, redevelop it according to current standards, take care of whatever remediation is required through permitting through EGLE, the state department that monitors these things. That's different than saying, hey, you're liable for something that happened 50 years ago before you own the property. So they call it polluter pay, and it sounds good, but the bill is not about polluter pay. Already exists. This is about the new innocent owner pays for what the polluter did before. It's frankly just a very unreasonable law, but what it'll mean is that nobody will ever touch these properties again. There'll be properties that are permanently offline. Okay, Jacob, continue.
Yeah, and that's another bill that passed the Senate late last week. Another bill that passed the Senate is waiting a vote in the House is this expansion to the Consumer Protection Act in Michigan. Right now, different businesses and different fields that are covered by a regulating or licensing entity are exempt from the Consumer Protection Act. And there's a bill that would lift that excuse me, that would lift that exemption and expose a lot of different industries to like a double remedy in cases where some sort of wrongdoing is happening. We found that most of the time these are taken care of, these are remedied by the governing or regulatory body that's overseeing this field, but this would also expose these businesses to lawsuits under the Consumer Protection Act as well.
All right, very good. And so I think we got one or two more that are still kind of live.
Just one more. And this one is unique compared to the other bills that we've talked about. So all of the issues that we've discussed so far are bills that have passed the Senate and are now waiting for a vote in the House. The House is there's more uncertainty with the House right now. So it seems that if a bill has already passed the House, the conventional wisdom would say that the Senate should not have as many problems cleaning up these issues and passing their bills as the House would. But Brian had discussed earlier that potentially a member of the Senate not committing to coming to session may also present problems there. So this next bill is something that has been referred to as price gouging. It's essentially price controls in certain declared states of emergency. So Michigan has a price gouging law already on the books. It's not specifically defined to states of emergency, but states that if there is a price increase that's found to be in gross excess of what the market conditions mandate or would suggest, that this is an act of price gouging. This new law drills down on that quite a bit more. So it adds a provision that we're specifically talking about in declared states of emergency and states that an increase in prices by 10%, it was amended in the House to be 20%, could constitute a price gouging. So, and if you are found to be increasing your prices by 20% in a declared state of emergency, this could launch an investigation from the Attorney General. So obviously, something that we find pretty problematic. 20% is what had been was increased from where it was initially at 10%, but 20% could easily constitute a regular market increase on a lot of different things. And this law would apply to energy, would apply to like gasoline or retail goods and lodging as well. So this was something that had passed the Senate late last week, and it also passed the House. There were two different packages of bills, one that was introduced in the Senate and one that was introduced in the House. Both passed their first chambers, and both are off to the other chamber now. So while it's not headed to the governor's desk yet, it does seem that there is support on both sides, both the House and the Senate, amongst both Democratic caucuses to enact these sort of bills. So I think that of all of the issues that are on the board, I would say that this is the one that is most likely to be a risk to us. And if either caucus can get together a large enough group to vote, I would assume that this is on the agenda for them.
Yeah, great summary, Jacob. So these are issues that we're watching really closely. If the House and or Senate cannot muster functional quorums to do business, then obviously those risks go away. Now we're going to get into some first House bills. I just want to kind of let you know some good news, some things that we, including things that we did very robust calls to action on that got stopped in their tracks, and therefore, at least in the immediate term here, are not threats to us anymore. But before I do that, I want to run through a couple questions that have come in here in the chat. So Paul had asked which Republicans voted in favor of the UIA increase. They're actually all in the UP. So one senator and two state representatives, Senator McBroom and Representatives Preston and Markinen were those. Now in the UP, the utilization of unemployment is more common for longer durations, given the seasonal nature of a lot of the work there. So we weren't particularly surprised. We do believe that was kind of a regional consideration in terms of, as opposed to say a philosophical one. The that's not, I mean, obviously we still opposed it and made it clear that we opposed it. But the, there was a question, can these, assuming we're talking about Earned Sick Time Act and the tipped wage credit, can these things be done next session when at least in the House of Representatives, I think there will be a clear priority to do that. The answer is yes, it can be. These things can be changed next term. We do expect that that fixes to the Earned Sick Time Act and restoration of the tipped wage credit will be among the first bills that are taken up in the House of Representatives. So it will be in play. I think it will pass the House. The question is, can there be a deal made with the Senate and one that the governor would accept? Big open questions. But the answer is yes. We will not stop or even slow down or pause or anything this work. We just keep on continuing. It's just that it's unlikely that a bill would go through a whole process, get passed before February 21st when this needs to be implemented.
Staying
So
on ASTA, there was a lot of questions about could a lawsuit be started now? Can you just explain like what the process was for us July 31st and then the idea of a lawsuit now to essentially like delay this? There's just so many questions on that.
yeah, so I don't think there's any, the reason that I don't think that a lawsuit is really a likely way to get any relief is because remember where this all originated from. It all started because of an action by the Supreme Court. So the Michigan Supreme Court made a decision which resulted in the implementation of these two new laws. They're actually old proposed laws that became two new laws, February 21st, 2025. There's nowhere to appeal to. You know, there's not, that's a court of final jurisdiction. And so that this avenue of trying to challenge it, it really left us with the legislature is really our only, the only place that we could go for relief on this, short of the Supreme Court saying we erred in our decision. But it's the same. Well, not actually, it's not the same, people. I think that actually the chances of the Supreme Court next year reversing it actually go down than the same people from before. So so unfortunately that's it's just not feasible that the Supreme Court is going to reverse itself. The question on unemployment, is there any chance the next term that there could be a reversal of the unemployment? I wouldn't I mean, just changing a law in divided government. A divided government usually means that laws don't change as much. And so, you know, the law has changed to put some step increases in. So I wouldn't say it's certainly not impossible for the new legislature next year to negotiate other changes to moderate the impacts of the unemployment changes. But it will be an uphill battle, particularly to get it through the Senate. Now, that said, there are steps. So there's one step that will happen. The unemployment weekly benefit will go up basically right now, but January 1st. The other steps that haven't yet been implemented are much easier to change or curtail than the ones that have already been implemented. So so definitely will be an active issue. Question here, any idea when and how much our rates will increase? And again, talking about unemployment, not yet, but I think it's fair to say that there would be a proportional effect. So if payments out of the unemployment fund are going to increase by 70%, then the experience by employers at large, remember, this is 100% employer funded. So if the benefits increase by 70%, the amount that employers pay will increase by 70%. Remember, that's 70% over the next 2 years. January 1st, January 1st, January 1st, the next three, January 1st coming up. Over that 2 years, 70% increase. My only caveat or asterisk on that is that 70% is not evenly distributed. So you have an experience, as all of you would know, you have an experience credit And the more often that you have layoffs, the higher your proportionate impact would be. So some of you would experience an increase higher and some lower based on your experience. So yeah, I see your question here, Scott. Why am I feeling ill even before 2025 has started? Yeah, we're with you. There was a question about how about if we should we go ahead and just implement these PTO policies? Yeah, I think it is time to start really thinking through the policy, the parts of your employment handbook and your policies that need to change. We have started to shift into this mode as well. So a resource guide, potentially some templates. One of the things that we know from experience with the department is that they're not going to give anything that looks and feels like legal advice or something very specific to your business. They just don't see themselves in that role. I wish that they would do more of that, but it seems very clear that they won't. They'll put out FAQs, but when you say, how about here's what I'm going to do in my business, is this okay? They're probably not going to answer those kinds of questions. Actually, I'm not going to say probably. They're not going to answer those kinds of questions. But we're going to do our best to walk through that with you, to help you think through those types of changes, to put out maybe some model policies, some ways that you might be able to live with these policies that fit within the confines of the law, but also diminish the impact or the negative impact that these policies might have on your bill or on your business. So let's get back into I want to get back into some of the issues too, because actually, need some good news, I guess. There's a bunch of what we call first house bills that have not passed the chamber, have not made it to a point where they're eligible for final passage and therefore are probably dead. So let's just run through some of those and maybe kind of ease your mind on a few issues that haven't come up yet. So Kelly, there was another, there's the Earned Sick Time Act, but there was this other proposal for a 12-week unemployment style paid family leave benefit that, an employer, a joint kind of employer-employee funded program, huge new bureaucracy, but we're feeling pretty good that one got stopped.
Yes, the gifts that keep giving. That's what it felt like last week. So this was a proposal that we had notified our membership about quite a while ago. It was referred to as My Flock, and it was a family, medical leave program that started at 15 weeks. And last week was essentially pared back to 12. There's a similar model nationally that's been attempted to be implemented in Minnesota that's not going well, that this legislation was modeled after. We did a call to action on this last week. It was brought to Senate committee and was passed out of committee. So we were really worried that this would pass through the Senate and be sent over to the House. Brian, you mentioned this was a UIA-like system, very much so. It was going to be set up within the government. You would essentially, your employees would go to the government to get their time off. It was intermittent leave. It was going to be a deduction off of, a payroll tax that would be paid into the system through the government. It would cost a whopping $16 to $17 billion to create the system. It's just jaw-dropping. This kind of proposal would be considered during a time when we have to deal with so many other things and have been dealing with so many other things since COVID. And so we worked really hard in order to relay to the senators, the Senate specifically, on how this would be costly, hard to implement, another tax on employers. While in theory, this very much sounds good, the practicality of implementation and what this means for people was not really being relayed effectively in order to be transparent. And so again, we cannot say thank you enough for responding to this call to action. It was one of the highest calls to action we have ever seen go into the system, into the House, into the Senate, and into the governor. It only passed out of committee. It did not get voted on the floor in the Senate, and that's because of all of you who told your story about how this was not going to be something that should be taken up. And so we feel this is something we can celebrate, that we actually were effective Not that we aren't effective, but just something that we effectively communicated that would be a burden on the employer community, and that there are better ways to do this. And so it was a case that we made, and we feel very good that that one was stopped.
All right, so that's one that did get stopped, and intermittently here, I'm just going to address a few questions in between these. The somebody had asked for the bill on the bill number for the Earned Sick Time Act changes, and there is a bill number which I don't happen to have here. Do you guys have
It's
it?
6058, correct, Jacob? Oh, no,
It's 6057 is
thank you.
the bill for is the bill that was introduced in the House. And I will say, if you do look at that bill, the language in that bill is not fully reflective of what our desired changes are to the Earned Sick Time Act. I have the link handy actually. I will send this in chat. And this has a full list of what we wanted to see changed, and that's not fully reflected in House Bill 5067. 5067. But this is what we were trying to work towards, and we'll continue to advocate for next year.
There are
Yes.
things in the legislature called shell bills where you introduce the concept and then you can amend it during the process. We were not able to get to a point where there was consensus in the chambers in order to actually add the meat on the bones of the link that Jacob shared. And so when you look at that, you're probably going to think that we've lost our minds, but I promise you we had not. It was to begin the process. So please do read the link of what we were going for, not actually that bill number.
Yeah, bill was just like they call it a vehicle, just a bill to put the eventual compromise language into, but in the House, they essentially killed the bill before the meaningful language got added to it. So there's a bill number, but it's not a meaningful bill. It's a vehicle that just didn't end up getting driven. So and then another question came up. Our members are looking for an actual checklist that they can follow to comply with ESTA. This is something that a checklist is going to be a little bit tricky because not every issue will affect every business. But yes, this is exactly what we're doing. The only reason that we didn't do it ahead of time is because we didn't want to put something out there not knowing for sure what the final law was going to be that you'd have to comply with. Now that we do feel like that work and the last several days as we've kind of understood what the landscape was and that changes to ESTA would probably not happen before implementation was required, we've shifted into compliance mode, tools for compliance, and a checklist of here are the main things that this changes, here are the things that are prohibited, here are the things that you must do, and also some ideas on how you might implement it and stay compliant, but still keep control of your business. All right, another victory, what apparent victory is there was a series of changes to the workers' compensation system that would have overturned the reforms before. For those of you who have been in business since before 2011, you'll remember that Michigan had usually in the top 3 most expensive workers' comp systems in America. So we were very uncompetitive. There's a series of changes and reforms that were made that made Michigan very mainstream with how workers' comp worked. But there was a proposal that we think would have increased the cost to employers by at least 20%, but probably more like 40%. That made it out of Senate committee and then got stopped. Is that, if I got that right, Kelly?
You are right on track. This was another one we were very worried about, and the chair of the Senate Labor Committee was very clear. Outside of the moving the unemployment insurance legislation, this was his next biggest thing to get through. It did get it did it did gain some traction in both chambers in some way. There was some back and forth. When it was clear that it was not going to necessarily move in the Senate due to some advocacy efforts within the business community and in the insurance community as well, there is a vehicle bill in the House that essentially reflects it. And so there was an effort to try and move it over in the House instead. We were able to be effective at stopping that as well. What Brian said earlier about a vehicle bill. And so there was a lot of confusion surrounding this legislation. When the reform happened in 2011, that really was a leap to best practice in order to make Michigan more competitive. And essentially, what this legislation would have done, which would have peeled back a lot of those things, that was a leap to best practice. So it removed a distinction between disability and broadening the definition of what a disability was. It would broaden claims. It it eliminated work search requirements. And that also made a date change where people could bring claims retroactive to 1985. Like the fact that we would even be considering claims for the past, like, I mean, I was born in 83, so I just can't even, like, now I just gave my age away, but even thinking about something like that is just really crazy during this time. But as Brian said, would have increased premiums, we think, at least 20%, if not 40%. It did pass out, like I said, of the Senate Labor Committee. The Senate did not take it up for a vote because of that advocacy efforts on the floor with those senators, on the floor with the House, to make them understand what this would mean. And so we feel, again, thank you for answering that call to action, because it did make a difference. And then us being in the building explaining this to legislators kept this at bay. So another scary one, but seems to be something that we were able to put away.
I would, so I think what I'll do with the remainder of our time, because I want to get to a few more of these questions, maybe Sarah, I know you've been keeping track of those, and maybe you could identify some that you think need to be addressed, but let me just do a quick rundown of some others. So like that paid family leave mandate and the workers' comp system, we did calls to action. You responded. There were literally, again, thousands, record-breaking type response. I know it made a difference. Those were stopped. Thank you for doing that, and thank you for answering our calls. I know we asked a lot of you in the last couple of weeks, and it was important, and I promise you, it made a difference. There were other bills too. There were some wage transparency and increased penalties on employers for wage mistakes that were put through, essentially requiring that you publish your wages of your private sector employees. There were others that they called pay equity bills that were really gaining some traction that thankfully didn't make it to a second chamber, but really got the government involved in a whole new way of reviewing how much you're paying each of your employees and determining whether or not you're discriminating against anybody. It was very, very kind of intrusive proposals. There was a mandatory participation in an IRA program that we feel comfortable has been stopped as well, and then an increase in the corporate income tax. So those are a few examples of things that didn't make it through. They were very active. They had a lot of energy. There were things that we were quite concerned about. Thank you for answering the call. Okay, Sarah, let's spend the rest of our 8 minutes here seeing if we can run through a few more questions. Anything stick out to you that we need to get to?
Actually, Brian, I was just reviewing again, and it feels as though you have covered most of them within the time allotted. A lot of comments and people concerned about us reaching more small businesses and a broad audience, and obviously we're doing our best there and sharing with their networks. But I don't see anything off the bat that has not been covered.
So maybe I could start then, or we could close with an ask, and I'll zero in on that. We share your concerns with these issues that we're talking about, that too many small business owners out there don't know about them. We have about 30,000 members, but there are literally hundreds of thousands of small businesses out there and across the landscape in Michigan. Please do take an interest in spreading the word. We have a great resource page on this. Please share it, put it out there. Anybody who owns a business, here's changes that are on your doorstep. We will make it a priority to, now that we know what the landscape is, to really create some tools that can help guide you through the process. But if you can help us spread that word on what's happening, all the better. Thank you for your engagement and involvement in it. Special shout out to Kelly and Jacob, who were, at the Capitol at all hours. They were doing these late night sessions, and that's when you really got, what they say, like, Your parents probably used to say, well, nothing good happens after 10 p.m. Well, that's especially true at the legislature. And so there were a lot of these nights where the sessions really did go into those kinds of hours. And the SBAM team doesn't leave it. They're in, we're there to make sure that the small business voice is heard and understood, and I know for sure that it makes a difference. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. This recording will be on on our website, and we'll share it in various other ways too. And as always, reach out to us if you have any questions. sbam@sbam.org is just a good kind of general email box to, if you don't have mine or somebody else's on the team, you can send it there and it'll find its way to the right person. Thanks for all you do.